Welcome and thank you to our Seattle Council PTSA celebration of the 2023 legislative session. We're going to start out with introductions from our legislators and from School Board Vice President Rankin. After that, we're going to start to get into some questions, starting out with what are you most excited about this legislative session? Senator Pedersen, I'd like to give you a chance to introduce and just say hello. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Jamie Pedersen, I serve in the State Senate from the 43rd District. I think I can stay blonde still. Maybe I'm looking a little more blonde, wearing a gray suit and a blue tie and a white shirt. And you may hear some trumpet practice in the background. And maybe some other instruments if my other children follow directions during the meeting. I serve on the Law and Justice Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, the Early Learning and K-12 Education Committee, and the Rules Committee, and serve as the majority floor leader in the Senate. Coming into this session, my most important budget priority was to increase funding for special education, and I am happy to say that with a lot of hard work from Representative Pollet, from Chair Santos, and a lot of other people in the legislature, we got good alignment around that priority and did make some progress. I think it's important for us to say right from the outset that the progress is not adequate. We have not by any stretch of the imagination fully funded special education, whatever that means. But we did make a significant step forward, I think, both in terms of the money and in terms of having a growing consensus among the legislators that this needs to be an area of continued focus for us until we get to the point where the state is funding basic education for kids with disabilities. We had a lot of discussion about that, and in the end, Representative Pollett's bill is what became the vehicle for our increases, and we'll let him talk a little bit more about that. But I just was really pleased to see how broad the agreement was across the rotunda, so between the House and the Senate, and between Republicans and Democrats. I was heartened even to see Representative Stokesbury, the new Republican leader, talking about increased funding for special education being one of the big accomplishments that his caucus was proud of. So I think that bodes well for our ability to continue focusing on these issues. I'll say last, I have 4 kids in Seattle Public Schools, so I get to hear a lot about it, but I don't hear from any of my children, who are all teenagers, so they're a little reticent. I don't hear from any of them as much as I hear from my husband, Eric, who teaches in a distinct classroom at Roosevelt High School, and brings home his experiences and struggles and joys every evening for all of us to consider. And so I'm grateful to him and to all of the parents and teachers who make that system as good as it can be every day, and look forward to continuing to work with all of you and with my colleagues who are here on the call in future sessions to do a better and better job of making sure that we provide adequately for these kids.
Thank you, Senator Pedersen. And funding special education has been something that we have focused on, talked about, advocated for, and set as one of our top priorities. So I really appreciate you bringing that forward right from the beginning. Representative Pollet, since Senator Pedersen mentioned you, I would like to shift to you next. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting us. It's we didn't know when we planned tonight that we'd be coming back from a one-day special session. And thank you for the kind words, Senator Pedersen. I'm Representative Jerry Pollet from the 46th district, and which is just north of the 43rd district. So basically runs from the University of Washington north to the Seattle City line and Lake Washington over to Aurora, roughly. And I am a white male, 64 years old, with white hair and a white beard, and am sitting outside in the sunshine, and hope that I'll get to stay out here all evening. I do want to say that the 46th District Democrats are also meeting tonight and have us on the agenda for a legislative update after 8 o'clock. So I may swing off of this for a short period of time. I would pick up right from where Senator Pedersen left off, which is on special education. The reason all the 4 caucuses said special education is a priority for the session was due to the organizing efforts that the Seattle Council PTSA really led on, with a collaboration with Seattle Public Schools and board member Rankin, and with the support of Seattle Public Schools administration, being able to spend, starting in the summer, reaching out across the state to other PTSAs, to other school districts, other school boards, and putting together a really a broad-based coalition like we haven't seen for special education funding before. It included a lot of our disability advocate allies and WEA. But, at the beginning of session, right before session began, Seattle Council PTSA put on a forum online with recorded interviews of what special education lack of funding meant to people. At the beginning of the school year, we had a pretty clear roundup, district by district, of how much money each district in the state was spending out of their levy funds on special education. And it was roughly $500 million for the coming year. So let me repeat, $500 million. Seattle Public Schools was nearly 20% of that figure. And that was driving Seattle Public Schools to have a deficit, which I'm sure Board Member Rankin will talk about. But the bulk of the deficit for Seattle Public Schools and our school districts across the state is special education funding. And there are 3 elements to special education funding. The first is, for every student who has an individual education plan, the state provides a multiplier, basically doubling the amount that is given per student for basic education for the full enrollment. And then the second piece is, if you have extraordinarily high costs, over $30,000 roughly, then you can apply for reimbursement for that individual student, say if they're being placed in a private setting or have very high cost therapy. And the third piece is the cap. And this is truly what I would call an unconscionable and unconstitutional cap on how many students in each district that the state of Washington would fund special education services for, despite the fact that federal law and state law both say you must provide all the services needed for a child to succeed in their individual education plan. That may be speech therapy. It may be in instructional aid 50% of the time, or maybe full-time. It may be physical or occupational therapy, and it may be specialized reading instruction. So those are just examples, and they're not inexpensive, of course. But the state of Washington at the beginning of this session was capping how many students it would provide reimbursement for in each district at 13.5% of their enrollment. And I think what we very successfully did in partnership across the state was say, let's look at the prevalence of disabilities. The CDC estimates 1 in 5 children nearly have dyslexia. Let's look at the prevalence in the African-American community of certain of autism, which is higher than the general population. And when you add that up, you realize 13.5% is far less than the percent of students with disabilities who should be entitled to an IEP. And so we had a very strong effort to remove the cap and fund every child who deserves to have their education fully funded. What was the end result of our organizing and your testimony? I want to highlight also Ian Fogg's testimony, who got to participate in the governor's bill signing. That was I hope was very special. And the end result is that, I remember I said we were $500 million behind per year. That would be $1 billion over the biennium. We made an investment, which is really huge, of $420 million in the biennium. So roughly 44% of the deficit is what all the money we put into special education will cover. So Senator Pedersen said, we didn't get there. We got to about 40%, which is the biggest investment we've ever had since I've been in the legislature and working on special education. In fact, since I began lobbying on special education when my kids were in elementary school. So it was a banner year, but we didn't get there, and we lifted the cap from 13.5% of students in the district to 15%. But even Seattle, which had started the year below 15%, and it right now is over 15%. And about 70 school districts are already over 15% and will face a cap next year. So we still have work to do, and there are school districts and organizations that are saying they will likely sue the state of Washington over the cap. And I think that that was made more likely by what I consider to be a unfortunate and bizarre veto by the governor of a study in the special education funding bill. We had an equity study of what is the prevalence of disabilities and how might you structure changing the cap. And the governor vetoed that study, blaming it on data access for the state auditor, which is a tiny portion of the study's provisions, and kind of smells like a little spat between the governor's office and the state auditor. And I think that it was very unfortunate. I don't know, but we think we preserved the money in the budget today. I didn't see a veto message about whether the money for the study is still preserved, but would just be delayed by a year in beginning it. But it's very important to have a major study of what are the prevalencies of disabilities, what are the best practices for inclusion in the classroom. And we did put money into improving inclusion in the general ed classroom. As part of that, I'm sure that we'll want to talk about isolation and restraint and what's happened there, but that's the big picture on special education. And I do hope Senator Pedersen will come back and talk about the Skills Center success for funding Seattle Public Schools, which he gets the kudos for.
Thank you, Representative Pollet. And I would like to shift to Representative Santos, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us to join you this evening. For the record, my name is Sharon Tomiko Santos, and I will say I've never had to describe myself before, so I'm going to do my best. I think it would be fair to say I am a little south of middle-aged. I have salt and pepper hair, which is pulled back. The only other primary noticeable feature, if you were looking at me on the screen, is that I am currently wearing a rigid cervical collar because I had a skull fracture. So with that, let me give a bit of introduction of myself. Some of you may know I represent the 37th Legislative District, which is the most diverse legislative district in the state of Washington. I'm very proud of that fact because as another point of pride, this is the district in which I was raised and in which I was educated from elementary through junior high school and high school. I am the daughter of educators. My mother was a special education teacher who was a leader in what then was considered very innovative practice called mainstreaming of special education students. In other words, deinstitutionalizing our special education students and giving them access to their neighborhood schools. So I think she would be very proud of what is going on today in the way of building inclusive practice as the next vanguard statement to fully realizing the humanity and the civil rights of students with special needs. My father is also an educator. He's a different type of educator. He's an educator of adults and had served as the resident minister for a Japanese-speaking congregation. So I'm the daughter also of an immigrant as well as of an American-born citizen who was incarcerated because of her race during World War II. I think it's important that I share those elements because as both Senator Pedersen and Representative Pollet indicated already, this year was very much marked by a focus on special education. And it's very important that we unpack the many ways in which special education served as sort of a central focus for many of the education efforts during the 2023 session. Certainly, funding is an important piece. One element that I think is critical for me to mention, since neither the Senator or Representative Pollet mentioned this, is while it is, and I believe it is the responsibility of the state to fully fund our portion of special ed, let us not forget that the federal government has failed from day one to bear their portion of special education funding. In other words, this federal government promised to provide 40% of all special education funding. And so I'm going to let that hang for a moment and ask you to consider, where would we be today if from day one, the federal government honored its promise and its obligation? So funding is important, and I will not deny that, but there are many parties who are responsible, not just the local government, meaning the school districts, not just the state, but also the federal government. But I think it's also important for us to take a look at some of the policies that we looked at this legislative session that also account for the focal attention on special ed. And I would identify two themes as being critical to the bills that we looked at this legislative session. One theme is about responsibility. Who is responsible for what? And how, and the second theme was accountability, making sure that those people who are responsible for providing special education services, whatever they may be, and Representative Pollet and Representative Sen in the House both advanced legislation to make sure that we had evaluations that were provided in a timely fashion so that IEPs could be developed, and so that students could then receive their special education services. Unfortunately, both of those bills did not survive to the end of the legislative session. You already heard about the large isolation and restraint bill. That is another piece that I think we spent a lot of time on, and it's a very complicated, complex issue that is very much akin to flying the airplane while you're building it. And unfortunately, that bill did not see the end of the legislative process. Sadly, that means that many students' civil rights will continue to be violated. But we also had, and I see one of the primary advocates online, we also had bills to address how are we going to even untangle the complaint system. Our complaint system for providing the public and the partners in the education system, whether they were our educators and school districts, or whether they are community members or advocacy organizations, it has been a very opaque and arguably a very backward system that was built on a notion of more around law and justice than around making sure that people are being heard. So all of those bills had ample time to be heard. They did not make it around the system, but thank goodness we are organized as a legislature around a 2-year structure. So we're only completed the first year of the biennium. The second year is still to come in 2024. And I think I saved a couple of bills for talking about successes later, but I did want to just say congratulations to all of us for really pulling together in the same direction around bringing attention to the needs of our students, first and foremost, our family members, as well as our educators and the education system, because we all need something in order to be able to come to the table and create the conditions where learning and teaching can thrive. And I think I should just end right there, so that we can get to some of the questions, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about some of the things I'm proud of that we have accomplished.
Thank you, Representative Santos. And I just wanted to take a moment and say that I hope you are healing well, and we extra appreciate you for being here with an injury. So thank you, and your commitment to all of us is really, it's something for which we are very grateful. But I want to go to School Board Vice President Rankin.
Thank you. So good evening, everybody. I'm Liza Rankin. I am your current school board vice president, and I also serve as the board's legislative liaison. My most important role, though, is as a parent to 2 students in SPS. And what was the, did you want us to talk about, I can't remember what else you wanted us to talk about. Anything about the session?
Introduction, visual description, and a little bit about who you are. And
thank you. That's all just completely went from my head. So visual description, I look like a Seattle mom, I think. White, middle-aged-ish. I have brown shoulder length curly hair. I'm wearing a kind of charcoal black t-shirt. I have a blurred background behind me. Let's see. I come to the board from, so I was elected in 2019, and I come to the board from being a community advocate and working on a lot of issues, bringing forth a lot of issues to the school district, and realizing that there's always deeper than you think to why things are a certain way, and I sort of worked my way to legislative advocacy, and now all of those things have kind of come together for me in my role as the legislative liaison on the school board. Yeah, so I have two kids in SPS, and I also come from an education background. My grandmother was an English teacher and once returned a thank you note to me with grammar corrections in red pen. And she thought she was being very helpful. And my parents are both psychologists. So my mom was a school psychologist in the Edmond School District. And my dad is a now finally technically retired, very long time developmental psychologist working at the University of Washington and at Children's Hospital. And I don't know how much of it is hereditary and how much of it is environment and growing up in a household where we talked about kids and education and challenges and processes and trying to get services and different things. But I know that their work has been a strong influence on how I've arrived at where I am. My kids both attended the EEU, which is the Experimental Education Unit, which is a fully inclusive early learning education center through the Herring Center at University of Washington. One of them attended as a typical peer through kindergarten before going to our neighborhood school for first grade, the year of the 2015 SEA strike. And then my other son started as a typical peer and then had disabilities identified while he was there. And the value of having a classroom with professional educators who have, in combination, the knowledge and expertise of instruction and child development was invaluable. And I know that my son received intervention earlier than he would have if we hadn't been there for some speech and motor processing delays. And that experience as a parent has been tremendously influential on how I move through advocacy and what I know is possible for children. The EEU is called experimental education because in the 60s, I think my dad moved to Seattle to work at the University of Washington in 1968. And it was experimental because the experiment was whether or not children with Down syndrome were capable of learning. And we know that, of course, they are capable of learning. And so that is how the EEU started. My parents actually met at the Herring Center, and it still has continued to grow and expand in what they do. And they're such a great resource and model for what's possible for all kids, and how valuable it is for children to learn together, and that people with disabilities are everywhere around us. But we just don't always see them at school because of the way different structures have been created and barriers imposed on their access to their learning. So yeah, I want to take a moment before moving to other things just to thank very much the legislators here on the call. I think what I'm probably the most proud of is this session is the level of collaboration and the partnership that we had between myself, this team on the call, other legislators, our superintendent, SPS staff, and then legislative staff too, and our SPS lobbyist and folks. We really, I think, as other people mentioned already, I've been the legislative chair, well, I guess co-legislative chair previously, and I've also been the legislative chair for Seattle Council PTSA, and I have not experienced or seen the level of coordination collaboration around the same top issues. And so I just really appreciate that partnership, and I'm excited for it to continue in service to our students.
Thank you, Vice President Rankin. And I would like to take this moment to shift to our co-host today is Seattle Student Union. And Chayton, I'd like to give you a chance to introduce yourself and your.
Yeah, totally. Hi, everyone. My name is Chayton. I use he, him pronouns. I am, for a visual description, I am a mixed race individual. I have black glasses, black hair, and I'm currently wearing a dark gray shirt. And yeah, here as a representative, as the executive director of the Seattle Student Union. We were founded 1 year ago off of some COVID safety demands to really help our students in schools. And ever since then have really, taken a leadership role for students and with students and by students. Making sure that they have a voice at the table, especially this legislative session, to advocate for things that help all students, and in particular, advocate with our PTSA friends on special education and general education funding for our students as well. And yeah, I think that's a little bit about the Seattle Student Union and what we do. I think next, want to ask the first question, and reminding people that we have Somali and Spanish interpretation. And yeah, the first question is to the legislators in particular, what moment they are most proud of And we're going to start with Representative Pollet.
Representative Pollet, you are muted.
I think you got to go to someone else because I'm not hearing anything for some reason.
All right, in that case, we are going to shift to Representative Santos, and we'll see if we can help Representative Pollet with some of the tech issues.
That's a tough question because it's kind of like Christmas. Which present do you want to open first? There's so many to choose from. I guess what I'm going to say is one of the moments, and I'm reticent to do this in part because it will seem a little like pandering, but it's not. Let me just say I'm not. But I've had the opportunity this year to work on legislation that came directly from folks who are experiencing brokenness with our government. And, you know, so many times as legislators, we are asked to sponsor legislation that is the request of the governor or is the request of the superintendent of public instruction or the state board of education, or its model policy, which usually doesn't end up being very model when we get done with it. There were two such occasions this year. One which has nothing to do with education, but has everything to do with a person of color who is a small businessman who was apparently sent a survey by the state regulator. He didn't receive the survey, and the consequence of his not completing the survey was he was delicensed, and he was no longer able to make a living serving his primarily diverse community, let alone being able to make a living. And we were able to correct that. That bill did pass, but the other one, and Juliana Hilliard is on the line, and so I'm sorry to call you out this way, but I was introduced to Juliana, and through Juliana, her husband and her son, and to realize, I mean, I had known before that the lines of communication into our education systems is not always the easiest to navigate when you are a student or a member, a parent or a member of the family or community. And when you have trouble, it's important to be able to be heard and to know that there's going to be someone who takes responsibility for having heard you, and that there is some accountability for responding in an appropriate fashion. Honestly, that was one of the reasons I initially ran for office, and it's one of the reasons why I created the Office of the Education Ombuds, and why I set it outside of the education system so that it could have independence in helping to be an advocate for a quality education system, whether you are a student or parent or community member, or you are an educator. somebody within the system. And even having set up the Education Ombuds Office, we found ways to say we can do even better. And so we did introduce a bill, House Bill 1239, to create a uniform complaint system. Many of you on this line came forward to testify on why such a bill was necessary. Unfortunately, in the waning days before a cutoff, it did not get its final step. And so we need to come back again next year. It is important that we continue to lift up the voices of the people who are the users of our service and say, we need to be able to know what are the rules of engagement. We're not necessarily here to destroy the system, but we want the system to work effectively for us. And so to that extent, we want to reform the system. And so I really want to thank Juliana and her family in particular, but so many of you for advocating on that. There were many times when I met Juliana and family, it was so touching that it was it reminded me why I sought to serve in the legislature. And so thank you for that gift, Juliana.
Representative Santos, first I wanted to say thank you. The Bill 1239 is one that has been a priority for council, as something that we see the need for, and that we're looking forward to supporting and working with you on over the interim if you are open to that, because we'd love to get this across the finish line next session. But I wanted to, Juliana is here, and I wanted to give her just a moment to speak to this. So Juliana?
Thank you. And I'll just take a quick moment and just also pay my respects to Representative Tamika. The bill grew out of my son's experience of teacher abuse in the classroom, and working with Representative Santos, and just is a healing process for our whole family. And if we can keep more kids safer and make the process clearer, this is a real way to do it. So just wanted to say thank you and hope to get everybody's support next session.
Thank you, Juliana. Representative Pollet, I know you have to shift meetings, and I'm wondering if you have sound and the ability to speak before you need to head to the 46th.
I have sound again, but can you hear me? Okay.
We can hear you.
I'm very sorry I lost sound, and so I've got a combination. I've got put in earphone, and I'm glad you can hear me, but I missed what the introduction was to the discussion about 1239. So, and I see from June, the question was, what was I most proud of? You know, I think that you have three legislators with you here today who view our work very similarly as service, and what we are trying to do to improve education based on a lot of vast amount of individual experience and the experience of our loved ones and our community members and the educators and the advocates we interact with. And so I think about a question like this and think about what was it that our community wanted most. And, I didn't talk about, there are several other education bills that I had. But the most important thing I think is we had a priority to go all in on special education funding, as I said, and make a run at getting rid of the cap. Our work isn't done. So I don't want to say I'm proud. We accomplished a lot together, but we're not done. Chair Santos mentioned the evaluation bill, which goes hand in hand with improving funding for special education. Doesn't do us any good at all to improve funding if children are not getting evaluated for whether or not they have a disability. And we base that work on especially input from the Office of Education Ombudsman, with documentation that there are children who they have been working with who have waited 3 and 4 years to receive an evaluation for special education services. Those are 3 years of their lives that they will never, ever, ever recover. Never. And we've got to get that bill through. And there's a lot of concern. We made a lot of headway with school districts who were concerned about it, and educators. But I think we made a lot of headway. We reached a lot of common ground. And I think maybe we'll be able to do it next year. There's another major effort underway to address how do we teach reading. And this is one of those issues that bridges between the higher education system, which educates our educators, and our K-12 system. And what we know from science is that we don't teach reading to how to teach reading to our educators the way that works for most children. And we need to revamp that, and there's a lot of resistance to it. So that's another effort to be coming back for. But we made some other really fabulous strides. The federal government ended feeding children at school. The COVID funding program ended, and we couldn't pick up the entire price tag, but we funded basically providing the children with food in kindergarten through 4th grade in high poverty schools. And that will make a tremendous difference in learning. And it's a shame that we can't do that for every child in every school. It's one of those examples where the federal government really needs to step up, and we made huge investments with the federal government, and then people are fighting about cutting back federal investments. This is an example of where federal dollars are so important. Do you want children to be able to learn because they have a nutritional meal to enable them to learn every day? So those are some of the examples I would point to.
Thank you. And I'd like to shift to Senator Pedersen now, and same topic. We're asking about what you're proud of this session.
Thank you. Well, let me start by saying that I did want to thank Director Rankin and Dr. Jones in particular for the level of collaboration that we experienced. It really is a welcome development. It's been some years since we've had that level of engagement from the school board and the administration in such a positive way. And so I am quite grateful for that. I think that bore good fruit. Representative Pollet mentioned the capital budget investment that we were able to get for the Skill Center at Rainier Beach and for some other Skill Center funding around the district. That continues a long tradition of the Seattle delegation working collaboratively to get extra capital money, making up for the way that the formula disadvantages Seattle, at least a little bit, making up. Continued work to do on that, but I'm afraid we may have to wait a new House Capital Budget Chair before we make more substantial progress in that way. You know, in terms of stuff that I'm most proud of for the session, I guess I'll say we had a little bit of conversation as we were gathering about the work on gun violence prevention, you know, and obviously the school year started with a really tragic incident at Ingram. And I am, although I'm no longer the chair of House Judiciary or of Senate Law and Justice, I've continued to work on gun violence prevention, and I'm really happy with the progress that we made this year, including the ban on the sale of assault weapons and a bill that I prime sponsored imposing liability on manufacturers and retailers of firearms for the damage that they cause to our communities. So I would say that, you know, that's a proud moment. Another Representative Santos's description of her proud moment reminded me of another bill that came from a student at the University of Washington who is transgender, and asked me why it is that, unlike in Oregon, trans folks in our state couldn't seal the records of their name changes. She related an experience where a friend of hers had essentially had posted all over social media the court records of her name change in a way that was intended to harass her and, you know, sort of indicate that her biology at birth was what ought to follow her around. So in one session with large bipartisan majorities in the House and Senate, we were able to correct that and provide that protection for transgender folks, as well as for refugees and survivors of domestic violence. And in a year where we hear so many stories about legislatures around the country targeting transgender folks, targeting immigrants and refugees, it made me very proud of us as a state that we were going as fast as we could in the other direction, trying to protect our citizens and residents of the state. So that's probably enough for me, but thank you for the question.
Thank you. And Vice President Rankin.
Thank you. Well, I was super proud to be the guardian and accompanying adult for Ian Fogg to be at the bill signing of 1436. And Yana, who I see, Yana Parker was there with her son as well. That was a really special, proud moment. You know, as disappointed as we were that the primary sponsor, Representative Pollet, was not able to be there, it was definitely a proud moment to be there with community members, stand next to the president of WEA and folks from OSPI, and be there with students and see that, you know, see the hard work, hard fought funding that first big step towards fully funding special education, to see that be made into law was very, very proud moment. I would also, I was really proud of testimony on 1479, the isolation and restraint bill, even though that didn't go the way we were hoping it to, elevating the issue of isolation and restraint, of who it impacts the most, and of the impact that it has in our school communities, whether or not people are even aware that it exists. You know, that the children who are the recipients of these practices are spending a lot of time out of the general education classroom, in some cases even out of having access to their own neighborhood school. So there are a lot of communities that they're just not aware this is a thing that happens to children in our schools. And so I was really proud to be part of elevating that. And even though it was heartbreaking, and there are so many different pieces that need to go into seeing that through, having the conversation with community and bringing it to that level is something I'm very, very proud of. And I know there's a lot more to talk about, and with special education funding too, you know, that having so many people be aligned across the state. I mean, when I talked to school board directors from other districts, we were all talking about the same thing: special education funding, and not just funding, but also how we serve students with disabilities in this state. Because I do have to say, and it's not the fault or responsibility of anybody on this call, but Washington State is far behind other states in this country in how much access students with disabilities have to general education with their peers. We have a lot to do to bring that up, and it's possible. It's absolutely, definitely possible, because we know there are states where students do have more access. And but I think I'm just proud of our collective efforts, and seeing the will in our state to keep this conversation up, because it's not only about students with disabilities, and it's not only about it's not only for parents of students who have disabilities. It's really about how we treat each other and who has access to full participation in our society, our communities. And so even though there was some heartbreak, there was, you know, some things that came out of some people's mouths that were really hard to hear. Even just being able to have the conversation at the level that it was had is something I'm very proud of and grateful to have been a part of. And I know that we will keep doing it. And so I'm proud of that, you know, collective legacy, I think, that we can all say that we were a part of, because I do feel like it's pushing us as a state and as decision makers into a place where we want to solve it. We want to get it right. We want to do better for students. So I am really proud of that. I know there were some, when Sam called this event a celebration, there were definitely some folks that were like, but we didn't get this and we didn't get that, and what are we celebrating? And, you know, the outcome of everything wasn't exactly what we wanted, but there's still a lot to celebrate about the ways in which we all came around our students and public schools and are demanding better of ourselves and of each other. And that's, yes, I'm actually very, very proud of that as I'm saying it, kind of realizing that. And I'm excited to continue being part of moving us further and further into understanding how important the funding is, but also, as Representative Santos said, how important the responsibility and the accountability is. We could pour all the dollars in the whole state budget into a bucket labeled special education, and if we didn't talk about who's responsible for what, who's accountable, and how we ensure that students have access to the things they need, are being supported with the services they're entitled to. It, you know, with all the money in the world wouldn't help us. That said, of course, we also need the money to enable us to improve those things and provide those services. But, you know, all those pieces together are so important, and I'm very proud that we're in a position where we're reckoning with that and having that conversation. And then just a sort of side note, I would be very interested, Rep. Santos, in talking with you about the reporting and communication bill and how that might align with some policy and governance work that we're doing at the district level. So sometime before the next session, let's definitely compare some notes and see how we can support the efforts in both places.
Well, Vice President Rankin, that brings us to the kind of next question is, legislative sessions they're fast paced, a lot happens. We do have a lot to celebrate, and also there's more work to be done. And the way our legislature works, it comes in these bienniums. And so we get to keep our bill numbers. There are a few bills that I've heard referenced tonight: 1239, 1305, 1479. And I'd like to take a moment and just talk a little bit about how to have those conversations over the interim, and if there are other things that you all would like to be talking with people about, so that we can prepare to support and advocate again next session. And I also wanted to mention that Representative Santos and others have mentioned IDEA funding and federal dollars. In conversation with Senator Murray, we talked about the fact that if the federal government did its part and paid that 40% under IDEA, we would not have that deficit in special education funding. The amount that we are owed from the federal government is the amount that we need, and is that shortfall. And so I want to, as an advocate, as counsel, encourage everybody on this call to also reach out to federal legislators. I know I've spoken to ours, but the more that they hear from us, the better, because right now there's more effort going to fund. I guess Senator Murray put it as, there are a lot of dollars going to defense and less dollars going to make sure that the civil rights of our students are being honored. And I always do like to bring it back to the fact that when we are talking about a lot of the things that we worked on this session, we're talking about the civil rights of our students and how to make sure that all of our students are honored, that they are all supported in our schools, and that we work together. So again, those bill numbers for people listening: 1239, 1305, 1479. And I'm sure there are others. But
Can I interrupt really quick and just add a number into what you just said about federal funding?
Mhm.
So for Seattle Public Schools for next year, the budget deficit that we have just recently considered in a public meeting to come up with reductions, the deficit that we have is $130 million. That's the gap between what was spent in this school year's budget and what we will be provided in next year's school budget, or projected to have a next year's school budget. Of that $130 million, $90 million of that is for providing basic education in the form of supporting special education services. And we end up being one of the luckier districts in the state, because we can pretty reliably depend on local levies from our voters to pass. Other districts are not so fortunate and do not have those dollars to available to them to fund the basic costs that the state doesn't. And but just imagine if the feds could come through with that money for Seattle, what we could do with those local levy dollars for enrichment, which is their intention, how much could be provided for all of our students, including students with disabilities, to enrich their education and give them more opportunities that we want all of our kids to have. And I want to be very careful about how I say that, because I would not ever want people to take that as, oh, it's kids with disabilities' fault that we can't do these other things with funding. It's kind of a delicate thing to say. I do not want that to be anybody's interpretation, because for me, it's 100% non-negotiable of whether or not we fund the needs of students with disabilities. But it's also hard not to think about, the obligation that we're taking as a local community that actually belongs to the federal government, and how much more our local dollars could go for our whole system and for all kids if they were following through on their end of the deal. So $90 million.
Thank you, Vice President Rankin. And I'd like to go to Senator Pedersen, if you would. What conversations, what bills, what things would you like community to be engaged in during this interim?
I guess I am most hopeful that we can, while we have folks' attention, continue to make progress in terms of special education funding in the next budget. So we're going to have a change, it appears, in leadership of the Senate Ways and Means Committee in the next year, which is unfortunate for us, out of cycle, although I think Senator Robinson will be great as the successor to Senator Rolfes. But there are, we're about to go into a period of significant change in my caucus. So I just hope that people really take the opportunity to continue to have those conversations outside of the legislature.